Let's go to our guest now. In London is Kamal Helbawy, a former spokesman for the Muslim Brotherhood. Mostafa Ragab is the founder of the UK Egyptian Association. And in New York, Amr Magdi is a researcher at Human Rights Watch. And here with me in the studio, Jasmine el Gamal is a former Middle East policy advisor for the US Defense Department. Good to have you all on the program. I want to start with Human Rights Watch and Amr Magdi. Might it be that this is merely a 67-year-old man with a long history of health issues such as diabetes, liver failure, kidney failure, who had a heart attack and died? Or is the state somehow culpable for him reaching this point?
Well, it could be very much that he is an old man with chronic illnesses, but the fact that the Egyptian government has cut him from the outside world for more than 6 years prevented him from seeing his family and lawyers on regular ways. Actually, just maybe 3 visits by his family for 20 minutes each, for the past 6 years. And they were also attended by members of security forces who actually took notes of the conversation between Morsi and his family, not allowing him any privacy, not allowing him any confidential, independent way of raising his concerns. And the fact that he actually himself raised his health concerns in courtrooms 2 years ago and said that he suffered from diabetic comas in his detention, that his insulin dosage was not perhaps adjusted to his diet and his conditions, and that he was fearing for his life. He also mentioned that he had to stop eating prison food and only rely on canned food because he was fearing for his life. The fact that we are not able to communicate with him as a press, as human rights organizations, even when he is transferred to courtrooms, he's kept away from other co-defendants or lawyers. No one is able to hear him or communicate with him freely. He was not even able to watch news or read newspapers. He
Understood.
didn't even have a bed in his cell. So he developed back pain and neck pains. All of this, these are very suspicious situations that has to be investigated.
Okay, Mostafa Ragab. Suspicious, needs to be investigated. He's an old sick man who was put in solitary confinement for 23 hours a day. This is political persecution, isn't it? Because he was on the losing side as the former president who was ousted in a coup. That's why he died.
Well, we're going to hear a lot of allegation now and a lot of complaints. And when Mohamed Morsi appeared in court at any time, he looked fit enough and healthy enough. And he was visited by high-profile officials from all over the world. Egypt or anywhere, any country in the world, they do not offer luxury prisons, neither in a state or in Great Britain. Prison is a prison, and he was spending a 20-year sentence, and that was expected anyway. That's the inevitable that this death will happen in custody. But of course, we have to say that the Brotherhood will make a big meal out of his death. But what I'm looking here at is a very serious issue. I say this is an issue that's been resolved by God, because if the trial that Morsi was facing now was ended with him being guilty, then the only sentence is the death penalty. And the Brotherhood would have made a big meal out of that. So this issue has been handled by God, solved by God. And what we're hoping for is that those issue will end there, and we will not suffer any more than that.
Kamal Helbawy, you've heard from somebody who is more inclined to support the Egyptian government and its narrative and President Sisi. First of all, your reaction to Mohamed Morsi's death and your response to Mostafa Ragab.
My reaction is that it is a serious issue, one of the crises that should be dealt properly by Egyptians and by people in the Middle East, in the Arab world, in the Muslim world, because of many issues here. One of them is violations of human rights. The second issue is the judiciary and the difference between treatment from one person to another we have two people. One of them is Morsi, one of them is Mubarak. There is a big difference between the two judiciary systems here and there. And I did not agree with Morsi while he was in power. I criticized him a lot, as I criticized Mubarak before. And now I am criticizing Sisi as well for bad government. We are trying to reach a proper state after the revolution of 25 and the revolution of 30s. But unfortunately, we did not achieve a big step in the field of human rights or better independent judiciary. So the death is death, the destiny is there, but the mistreatment and other issues can lead to death as well.
Right.
This is what I am against.
Okay. I want to bring
Violations of human rights.
Certainly. I want to bring in Jasmine el Gamal. Put it into context for us. What does it mean that Egypt's first civilian democratically elected president, Mohamed Morsi, first of all, ended up in jail, but secondly, ended up dead when he appeared in court just a handful of years after all that hope, all that revolution, all that democracy in Egypt? What does it say?
It doesn't say anything good. I mean, it really says that all of those hopes and dreams that you're talking about, all of that excitement and anticipation, and positive sort of steps that were taken by especially youth at the time have turned out to be for nothing. The revolution of 2011 and the elections that happened afterwards were incredibly exciting for Egyptians, especially for Egyptians under the age of 30, because you'll remember that if you were under the age of 30 at the time, the only person you ever knew as president was Hosni Mubarak.
Right.
And so to be able to have that choice, to see candidates putting forward platforms and to have a choice was incredibly exhilarating. And many people that I have spoken to, including friends of mine who've lived there their whole lives, thought that this was incredible progress, that it was the start of a new chapter, a new era for Egypt. Unfortunately, what happened is that change, that positive development turned out to be very superficial. And I think what that led to eventually was a complete apathy on the part of many Egyptians. What does it matter? You know, elections, we voted, nothing changed, on one hand. And on the other hand, for people who supported President Morsi or who support the Muslim Brotherhood, this incredible sense of persecution and a sense that they are no longer allowed to participate in Egyptian politics, Egyptian society, that they should just go hide somewhere and not be included in society, which I think does not bode well for the future of the country at all.
Mostafa Ragab, some people would look at Morsi's death and they'd connect it with news that came out in February where 9 people were executed for killing the country's former top prosecutor, Hisham Barakat. Human rights groups had said at the time, and they still maintain, that the 9 men were tortured into their confessions. They take the 2 threads and they stitch it into the same fabric. They see it as political persecution of the Muslim Brotherhood and anything and anyone that had anything to do with that democratically elected government in 2011 and 2012. It's true, isn't it?
No, let me first correct something that you said earlier on. Mohamed Morsi is not the first democratically elected president. Egypt has so many democratically elected before 52. Every term there was a democratically elected government there.
Name
so
one
he's not
democratically
the first one,
elected leader, sir.
And
Name one.
So many. You got Saad Zaghloul was elected.
Democratically
You've got
elected.
so many government. Saad Zaghloul was elected. And so many governors were elected before him. But what we want to look at here, Egypt is not living in a normal time now. After the revolution, there's so many groups who were fighting to take the lead in Egypt. The Brotherhood was one of them. And there should never be a group allowed to take hold or rule.
But Mr. Ragab, they won an election. Can you concede that there was a free and fair election and Morsi got 51% of that vote? The people voted for him. Whatever you might say about how he ruled, what the
No, we
Brotherhood
don't. We
did,
don't want to
do you
go. We
accept that
don't
it was
want
a
to go through
democratic
this
election?
path. For God's sake,
Was
you
it a
know very
democratic
well, and I
election?
know very well. People, the vote was against. It wasn't for. The two people were there for the election, and the Egyptian people didn't want any of them. So we don't want to go down that path again.
Okay, so
People
you don't
voted for
accept
Morsi against the other. No, people voted for the other against Morsi. But the majority of the Egyptian, yes, there's some people voted, but the majority of the Egyptian people, the vote was against. So we don't want to go down that path again. What happened is happened. We're looking now at a situation when Mohamed Morsi have died in prison. And as I said, this is a sad thing, but what we're looking at here, we don't want to make a big thing out of it. He's in the hands of God now. Justice will be done.
So
regardless what I say, what you say, what anyone else say, justice will be done for Morsi. He's in the hands of God now.
Is his death a symptom of the broader persecution of the Muslim Brotherhood?
Look, the Muslim Brotherhood have done so many prosecution in Egypt. They have operated, they have said it loudly and in the media. They've said we're going to make a bloodbath in Egypt. They said terrorists will start in Sinai. They said terrorists will stop if Morsi is out of prison. This all was in the media. So what we're looking at here, we're not looking at innocent group. We're looking at a group who plot and kill and damage.
So
and this is happening
is it
every day.
justified
And I'm saying to the people in
persecute them?
Egypt, of course, if you commit a crime,
that's all I wanted.
the
that's all I
death
wanted.
penalty does exist in
Amr
Egypt.
Magdi, is Morsi's death part of a broader persecution of the Muslim Brotherhood from a human rights perspective?
He wasn't
Well,
prosecuted, he died.
The question whether his death is linked to the harsh treatment he faced for 6 years should be a matter of an independent investigation that the Egyptian authorities are not capable of, precisely because they were the perpetrators of such conditions. His conditions were not unique. Maybe he faced one of the harshest isolation and one of the harshest mistreatment of prisoners. However, it's not unique. We documented that tens of thousands of prisoners arrested on political
You're just
grounds,
repeating what you said before.
mostly arbitrarily arrested and mostly kept without the basic rights according to the UN basic rights for prisoners, Nelson Mandela rules. The access to health care, the access to education, the access to family visits, lawyers' visits, access to exercise, and so on. All of these basic requirements are usually crushed in Egyptian prisons. Egyptian prisons have been infamous for decades, actually. It's nothing new, but under Sisi, the overcrowding of prisons have even been acknowledged by the National Council for Human Rights. Deaths in custody are on the rise all the time because of these conditions.
Okay, I want to bring in Kamal Helbawy because, Kamal, you know how the organization works. You were within the organization. The Brotherhood is clearly not happy with the death of Mohamed Morsi. And as we've mentioned, they see it as part of a broader persecution of the group, right? They've called for protests, but are they even in a position to even bring anyone onto the streets, given the current nature of things in Egypt right now?
It's a big mistake to consider that the death of Morsi is a problem or a cause to movement for the Muslim Brotherhood only. Morsi was for 1 year a president of Egypt. And we have another president of Egypt, Mubarak, who is still outside now, although his corruption and the many things he has done wrong during 30 years. What I am saying and confirming, don't confine the issue of the death of Morsi to the Muslim Brotherhood only. This is a big issue. Let us discuss it later if possible. But what we are talking about, did the aims and what the revolution wanted, whether the 25th of January revolution or the 30th of June revolution, whether it is applied and it is growing on or no.
Right.
When Sisi came to power, and I was a supporter of his coming, instead of Morsi, because of the mistakes done of Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood in power, we expected a future. We expected a democratic state. We expected dignity.
Right.
We expected economic situation proper. Nothing of this.
Okay, so allow me,
happened
and sorry
until
to
now.
sorry to interrupt you,
This
sir.
is a big question.
Certainly, I want to ask Jasmine about that, because talking about the mistakes of Morsi as we look at his legacy, because popular consensus is Sisi seized the opportunity, the army seized the opportunity given the protests. People protested because they were unhappy. The proposed constitutional changes, the people would say blaming the Copts and Shias for a lot of the problems and so on. What were the biggest mistakes that he made during his short time in office?
I think it depends on who you ask. A lot of people thought that he was a little bit aggressive in the way that he started sort of injecting religious vocabulary into his speeches. He started talking about Palestine. He started talking about Gaza. He started, they as an organization and as a president, he lauded the alleged killer of Anwar Sadat. They started talking about women and the way women should dress and the role of women in the society. And that made a lot of Egyptians uncomfortable, because as religious as Egyptians might be as individuals, as a society, generally speaking, they have never been comfortable with the idea of that religiosity seeping into governance. And so I would say that that was one of the biggest mistakes that he made. He misread the pulse of the Egyptian people when it came to the role of religion in government. Another issue is that Egyptians were just, I think, largely so excited about the change and about having a new president that they might have expected progress much faster than it happened. And I'm talking specifically about economic progress and progress on the security front. And within a year of his election, security was awful. I was there at the time, and it was just, you couldn't walk down the street and feel safe. And the economic situation was not what they expected either. Of course, you could argue that a year was too short of a time to make any progress. But there was a lot of fear that the country was going the wrong way from a religious perspective. There was also a lot of frustration that things weren't getting better as quickly as people wanted them to. I want to also mention one point to one of your guests who keeps saying that this issue was solved by God and it doesn't matter who won the election. It is absurd and dangerous to minimize the fact that Mohamed Morsi was a democratically elected president. This is not about whether you're pro-Muslim Brotherhood or anti-Muslim Brotherhood. This is about a person who was democratically elected for whatever reason, whether it was for or against. He was elected as president, and he deserved specific rights and dignities as a current or former president of Egypt. And a 67-year-old man who was jailed in solitary confinement, not allowed access to basic medical services, not allowed family visits, and not allowed any of the comforts of minimal comforts of a humane, prison situation. That is not someone who died because of an act of God. So we can go into debates about the Muslim Brotherhood itself and whether or not they are good or bad. That's a different program. But to minimize the fact that this was a democratically elected president who was inhumanely treated, and as a way to send a signal to a larger organization or its supporters, that is the issue we need to talk about, and you cannot minimize that.
We're going to have a round two here, because I wanted to talk about some of the broader geopolitical implications. President Erdogan said some strong things.
Can I just have a comment here?
Okay.
Can I just add a comment here?
Very briefly, because I have to wrap.
A quick comment here.
Okay, very briefly.
Yes, I was one of the first people after the election of Morsi, even though I didn't vote for him or for the other one, who said, let's now put our hands together and build the country. And I was one of the first people who came out after that, and I said, this country is going to go into a civil war. He is dividing the country into two groups. So when we look at mistakes, the biggest mistake ever he's done was offering the president of Palestine a piece of Sinai in return for the peace treaty in the Middle East. So that was a big disaster. We're looking at a disaster here.
Okay.
And what's happening now? Are people now not being divided into two groups?
Well, they are still divided, but not as bad as they used to be.
Well, I think a lot of people would beg to differ.
The country was going into a civil war. At least now we have the majority are for, not against. This is what I'm looking at.
Okay.
It doesn't matter.
Okay,
There's
listen.
no room for debate, and that is not a healthy path forward for any society.
There is room for debate on this show. Unfortunately, I'm out of time for this segment today. We're going to have a round two. I had so much more up my sleeve as well to discuss the broader geopolitical implications. We're going to have to save that for another time. But it's an extraordinary day for the region. Mohamed Morsi, born on the 20th of August, 1951, dead at 67. I thank you all for joining us here on the Newsmakers.